Hi, Paris. Thank you.
Hi, Katie.
Welcome back to Emerging Proud. Thank you so much for, yeah, being back with us. We were just saying, so we reconnected a few months ago and have had a few conversations, and it's been 7 years since our last interview, and you were in the Emerging Proud film, so was very grateful for that. And, we've kind of gone off on our own trajectories, but kind of reached a similar, I guess our paths have kind of merged again, which is, yeah, just been really delightful to reconnect
Mm.
and talk about where we're at now. And, I think I'm hopefully more grounded and a little bit more integrated than before. So it's been just really great to hear, where you're at now and your wisdom. So I'm really excited to share that with people today. Um, I don't know. So you were in New Zealand when we spoke before. I know you're back in the US now.
That's
Uh,
right.
so yeah, maybe like called back to land or you know, indigenous roots and all of that. So yeah, I don't know whether I could just hand to you, Paris, to give a little overview of your bio, what you're doing now, before we launch in. Just let people
Sure. Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Thank
Lovely to be here again. Thanks, Katie. Really appreciate this. It's always hard to try to create a nice, succinct
you.
summary of where I'm at, what I'm doing, since I tend to kind of like you, it sounds like, follow the flow a lot. But yeah, I've been in New Zealand for 10 years, and I did feel called back for many reasons back to kind of my homeland, the US, and particularly kind of the Rocky Mountains, the Utah area. This area really speaks to me. There's been a kind of an ongoing passion, but sort of evolving in my life toward, with supporting people through extreme states and through their own transformations and healing and holding. And but that's become more, in many ways, my interest has become more collective, sort of getting more and more interested in the kind of madness process, for lack of a better term, that's happening kind of collectively within human society that I see,
Mm.
and wanting and being really alarmed, by a lot of what's happening there and wanting to make a difference. And so much of my work, even though I'm still very much um, passionate about trauma, extreme states, the relationship between those, supporting people in their healing and holding. I'm also wanting to look more at the broader picture of kind of healing the rupture between humankind and the natural world. So getting more and more involved in sort of ecotherapy, deep ecology, kind of those movements as well. So at the
Mm.
moment, I'm just finding innovative ways of bringing those together. I mean, they're all related. We can maybe talk more about that, but
Yeah.
bringing those together in a practical way that can, support others who are starting to dip into that territory, and just generally helping others to heal those ruptures, whether it's within their own psyche or within their own family or community, or between us and our earthling kin, that rupture there that's so important to heal, I think.
Mm, beautiful. Yeah. So you are integrative psychologist, right? And you're in practice, but you also run workshops, courses, take people into the wilderness, is that right? Like kind of.
Yeah, so a lot of diversity. So I have some clients still, one-on-one individual psychotherapy clients. I also do a lot of supervision, which has actually become probably more of my staple work, you might say. Supervising other health professionals, um, as well as getting into developing workshops, trainings. Again, carrying on from the trauma, mindful somatic, especially approaches to trauma that I've been doing for many years, and then doing more and more in the kind of ecotherapy world, taking people into the wilderness, teaching other health professionals how to take their clients into the wilderness and that kind of stuff.
Amazing. Amazing. So yeah, oh gosh, there's so much I kind of want to pick up on, but I was just thinking about you were talking about like the rupture that's happening in the world, about how that's like a reflection of what goes on within us, right? When we go through the
Mm.
existential crises. And I know I've just been so we were talking before about not kind of having a direction but just going with the flow of the conversation, so I'm already thinking, oh, changing where I was going to start. But I know in the Emerging Proud film, so you appeared in the original film, and something that really sticks out to me about what you were speaking about then was chaos theory, and how we don't kind of, when we're in one paradigm, it doesn't just kind of naturally, seamlessly go to another new paradigm. It's kind of has to go through this chaos process, and it's like a reflection of what's going on within us when we go through these transformation processes. So yeah, and I don't know, I just from what you said there around like switching from working individually with people to looking at like the greater ecosystemic whole, kind of came up in my research in a way in terms of when people have their awakening experiences that are born through trauma, through the catalyst of trauma, they wake up to the fact that we are interconnected with the ecosystem. We are inextricably connected with the ecosystem, and so acknowledgement of that, and I guess reconnection with that is a part of healing. So, and I know you've written something around shifting away from the biomedical model, this very, like we were talking about before, atomistic, separate model of the paradigm that we're in at the moment, to seeing people as more sort of holistic beings. And I know you've written about something called an holistic organismic model of healing, right? I don't know if you can explain a little bit about what you mean by that, because that's what's coming to mind as you're talking.
Yeah, sure. Kind of in a nutshell, it's coming back to the roots of what it means to actually be a living being and how we share that with all of our fellow living beings, whether the humble amoeba or even bacteria, all the way up to the mighty redwood trees and and even whole ecosystems. You can say we basically share a kind of process of life. So the process in its simplest forms is essentially we're continuously taking in information from the world, and we're interpreting that information, particularly with regard to our needs. Is this like nourishment for me in some way? Is it dangerous? Is it food? Is it toxin? Is it friend? Is it foe? And then from that interpretation that we make, then we feel an impulse to act, to take in the nourishment and to push away or fend off, the danger. So this is kind of basic process, kind of organismic process that, again, you can ascribe it to all living beings. Like a single, simple bacterial cell actually has the same process. And then again, you can look at an entire ecosystem and even the entire Earth as a whole, like the idea of the Gaia theory, as in when you look at the Earth as a whole, has the same kind of process going on. And so it's kind of like a fractal in nature. You see the same process parallel throughout, like on so many different levels. So that's kind of the organismic process. That's what I'm calling the organismic process. It's been defined and described by so many traditions going right back, to indigenous times and whatnot, indigenous culture. But yeah, that's the term I like because it really emphasizes that all organisms share this process.
Mm-hmm.
And so and that is our most, as long as you're alive, that's happening, no matter how disabled you are physically, psychologically, spiritually, whatever might be going on for you. That's still, as long as you're alive, that's happening. That process is happening. So that's the wisdom that we all have as long as we're alive. But we get stuck in many ways. We get overwhelmed by certain, threats, dangers, factors, that can be very overwhelming to us. We have certain disabilities that can happen to us that can interfere with that process. So essentially the approach, rather than trying to find, rather than pathologizing a person as being wrong or broken, we come from the more wisdom centric, like, okay, what's the wisdom here that's trying to move towards health, healing, and holing? And how do we support that? And how do we look at what barriers are getting in the way and support them, them in moving through those barriers? So it kind of takes away the need to have, hundreds of DSM labels for, as we have with the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder. which is kind of the main Bible for giving people different diagnoses and things.
Yeah.
We can move away from that and we can actually look much more simply at this. Okay, here's this process. It's trying to happen for this person, like all people, like all living beings, but somehow certain needs are not getting met. There's some barrier there. What is getting in the way? How do we support them at identifying those needs that aren't getting met and removing the barrier and meeting those needs? So it's actually really quite relatively simple. I mean, it's still not always easy. So it's a much more, and it's also provides not only a holistic paradigm for looking at wellness in general, like you don't even have to just make a distinction between psychological and physiological, because actually you realize mind and body are two sides of the same coin. It's still all moving towards wellness. So even that kind of dichotomy can start to dissolve with this framework. But you also see wellness as a continuum. There's not like this, the sick and the healthy, or the so-called crazy and the sane, or the different dichotomies we tend to have. And if you can get away from that altogether and see our experience and our wellness is more on a continuum, of wellness, you might say. So
Mm.
that's in a nutshell the kind of the broad sort of mapping I'm coming from.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So would you say, Paris, through that lens, so if we see an organism um, as kind of not being out of balance, as kind of the whatever's manifesting, whatever behaviors or experiences are an indication of that imbalance, and this kind of the impetus, this natural impetus, innate impetus towards healing or growth or evolution, is that do you see that from a meta perspective of what's going on now within the world as like
Mm.
this that same process going on for like Mother Earth or the greater ecosystem is like everything, all of the brokenness we're seeing now is like actually an impetus towards a healing process?
Yeah.
Is that too simplified or is that
No, sure, maps are always going to be simplified relative to the actual territory. But yeah, so we see that movement towards health and wholing, towards, surviving and thriving, essentially. It's always there. I'll say two parts to this response. One is the individual, every behavior you see an individual doing, again, whether it's a human or non-human, is an attempt to try to meet needs, no matter how crazy or, non-consensual or whatever.
yeah.
That person or being is trying, even if they're not doing it successfully at that moment, to move towards surviving and thriving. So that's really helpful. There's no like random crazy behavior. It's just, that's always there. It's always happening. Everything we do is an attempt to do that. And then if you go to the broad, so you look at the broader systems, so you can look at if you take a human being, for example, every single cell in my system is doing this
Mm,
exact same process. Every cell is trying to survive in its own right, but it's also contributing to the larger whole, of my body, in this case, of my being. And so not only do we have this kind of intrinsic process towards maintaining existence and health of self, but we also recognize some level, whether or not it's fully conscious, we recognize we're part of a broader system and we're contributing towards that we're simply a part of the broader system. So each part, just like every cell in my body, is contributing towards my body, as long as it's healthy.
mm,
Um, each living being of an ecosystem is also contributing towards that ecosystem, whether they're fully conscious of it or not. It's actually it's intrinsic in the fabric of that being to not only maintain their own survival, but maintain the survival of their ecosystem. It's on and on and on,
mm,
all the way up to the level of the earth completely. And so
mm,
if you have this interesting, then this question about, well, look what's going on with humans, like we seem to be totally trashing our earth. If we're part of the earth, why is part of the earth trashing earth? It's like, again, there's often there's the analogy used of a cancer cell. A cancer cell starts as a normal cell, but at some point, for some reason, it forgets it's part of you. It's part of the larger system. Like, whether there was some kind of damage or whatever, you can leave that aside. But from this perspective, you can say it forgot that it was part of this broader system. And so now it keeps surviving and thriving itself, but now it's very individualized. It's no longer contributing to the larger system. And initially it thrives. Like, really, cancer cells tend to really thrive. because all their energy is just towards their own reproduction and survival. But no, they're no longer contributing to the larger system, and eventually they start to cause all kinds of interruptions and interferences with the larger system. And then, of course, we know where cancer can lead. So again, it's not necessarily like malintended. It's just forgot as part of the broader system. And if you look at humans from that perspective, it's not that, we're malintended, we don't want to destroy our Earth, but we forgot, at least on a collective level, that we're part of these broader ecosystems, that we're actually part of the Earth. And if we kill, if we destroy the Earth and our broader ecosystems, ultimately we destroy ourselves, just exactly as a cancer cell would do. And so it's really kind of a great, some people use the term the great forgetting. Like we basically forgot this connected is like, oh, that's right. I'm part of these ecosystems. So I'm part of this Earth. They are me. I am it. We have, surviving and thriving ultimately have to all come together. So this is where I think it's important not to sort of denigrate humans as being evil or wicked or bad, but actually, there's been a kind of forgetting that's happened. And the remedy is a remembering, and both uses of that term, not just literally cognitive remembering and experiential remembering, but re-member, to become a member again, right, of the greater system. And so that's, if we're going to get through this mess, that's what has to happen, in my opinion. Like we have to remember and re-member.
I love that. Gosh, I love that. That's because, yeah, I've been talking a lot about like how misunderstood the term awakening is, and like actually remembering is seems much more fitting than actually awakening, kind of an awakening, an awakening to the realization that we are interconnected beings, but a remembering because it's, yeah, it's something that we've forgotten. And I really like the analogy that you used around the cancer cells as well, and it made me remember an analogy that a friend of mine talked about in relation to her own process that she felt was a healing process for her psyche, but got diagnosed with psychosis. And she described it as her psyche purging. It was almost like this very natural need for her psyche to vomit. That's how she described her psychosis, was like, it's just my psyche vomiting in order to get the toxins out and to reestablish balance. And that just made so much sense to me. And it was like this complete on acknowledgement from the current paradigm around actually how helpful that process, that purging is. And that's kind of what I'm hearing you say. And I know, some of the work of yours, Paris, in your Rethinking Madness book that has been so instrumental to me in my journey is around differential diagnosis. And I'm kind of wondering what you see as the connection there between why the biomedical model is so sort of embedded to that separation, dualistic kind of understanding and lens, as opposed to this more holistic, organismic model. Is that part of like just that we've forgotten this? Is that just where we're at in, our evolution, that we've just forgotten about that?
Yeah, I think, well, there's a couple things. In some ways, I think that humankind, we're going through a kind of evolutionary growing pains, you might say, at the moment. But if you look if you narrow into like the question about the biomedical model and differential diagnosis, it kind of helps to, backtrack a bit to, there is you go back to, especially in Western, kind of the Western culture, and go back to the time of Newton, and it can even go back thousands of years. There's this kind of rupture in how we made sense of living ourselves and living beings in general. Are we basically just machines, or are we actually kind of, conscious beings, actually conscious kind of organic, organismic being? And the sort of, you might say, the mechanists kind of won out, especially with Newton's time. So, Isaac Newton, obviously, one of the founders of sort of modern, or I wouldn't say modern physics, but founders of physics, obviously classical physics, which then has evolved a lot since then, but classical physics and calculus, et cetera. he had a very, in general, he had a very mechanical sort of view of the world. Very atomistic mechanical view, we're all just kind of individualized, bouncing billiard balls and kind of going through the world. And there's this idea that, it's essentially very deterministic idea of the world, this mechanical way. And if you could, at any moment, if you could know exactly where all the little pieces were and what motion they were, you could predict the future forever. There wasn't any room for anything like free will or any of the kinds of what we often think of the kind of organismic wisdom. These kinds of things weren't even, it was just machines, the little arm had been turned, the wheels had been turned, and now the machines are sort of running down. And that ended up really having a major effect on kind of medicine in general. And then of course that ended up going into the world, into psychology and people with, more psychological based conditions, this kind of mechanistic attitude. And so from that attitude, there really isn't anything we could even call wisdom. We just, we've sort of evolved by pure chance, pure luck. We've evolved these, extraordinary bodies. And anyone would argue that, but it's all essentially a machine. So when a person experiences any kind of malady, again, whether it's predominantly physiological or psychological, we might say, then we have this belief that it's broken, something's broken, right? That's how we see it, like a machine. A machine's broken, and like a machine, you have to go in there and take it apart and try to fix what's broken. And so that's also where kind of allopathic sort of medical approach came in, the very power over approach. The experts going, you got to come in and fix your machine because your machine's broken. Right. So in a way, it really fits in with what became of the biopsychiatric model. And it's all this heavy kind of mechanistic diagnosis. What is broken and what, typically in psychiatry, what pill are we going to use to fix it, basically, or maybe surgery or something like that. Because there's no room in that model for the idea of the organismic process I was talking about, that there's actually, that this person is actually attempting to move towards health and wholeness in everything that they do. So it's a complete kind of rupture in these paradigms, kind of the organismic versus the mechanistic. And so the mechanism kind of won out, and of course it became very lucrative. It's very, you give someone a diagnosis. So we're going to let's just talk about psychology now and psychiatry. You give someone a diagnosis, and there's something like 400 different diagnoses now in the latest DSM-5. And you find the pill that's going to match that, and because their machine is broken from this perspective, they're not, something's wrong with their neurotransmission, et cetera. Then you give them some pill that's going to alter their neurotransmission systems, and they need to be on the pill the rest of their life. It actually ends up being a very lucrative, industry. And because it's so lucrative, they have a lot of money, and in a capitalistic system, a lot of money means political power. And so it keeps reinforcing itself. So if you kind of look at where the differential diagnosis came from, the big picture, it helps to see the mechanistic sort of paradigm that goes with it. They're kind of one and the same. Now, if you shift to what's wrong with you, to what's right with you and or what happened to you, so it's a very different perspective. The organismic perspective. So this person is acting really strange, or they seem to be, they're expressing really intense emotions, or, something odd about their behavior, or they're expressing certain perceptions that don't seem to line up with the consensual, reality, et cetera, et cetera. From the organismic perspective, we're saying that everything the person does and it is an attempt to move towards health and wholeness, whether or not they succeed, everything they do. So when you look at the most extreme, for example, conditions like psychosis, like your friend there, like what she described, you're finding that even sort of generating these kinds of extraordinary, anomalous perceptions and the kinds of things that go with beliefs and all of that kind of stuff that go with what we call psychosis, somehow it's still in the service of attempting to move towards a healthier place than where they were. And that's very much what my own research sort of, showed, was that when a person does enter kind of a psychotic state, it's not my favorite term, but we'll kind of keep that terminology. If they enter that, often what's happening is they were in a totally unsustainable state leading up to that point. Like you might say, often unconscious part of their psyche said, this is not sustainable. Like we basically need to break down our paradigm so that we can, attempt to emerge through into a more sustainable paradigm, more sustainable worldview and way of being in the world. And so that's kind of how I've come to see what we call psychosis is actually, the symptoms and catalysts could certainly be external, but then the internal, it's actually internally driven in the sense of attempting to move through what otherwise seemed like an impossible dilemma or an impossible, condition to move through and come out the other side. So if the person is supported, so rather than just seeing, oh my gosh, this person's broken, we need to, give them electroshock or drugs or this or that. And with this power over kind of dynamic, instead of coming from that perspective, we're like, okay, what is this person attempting to move through? What are the needs that aren't getting met? How do we help them to meet those needs? And how do we help them to move through this rather than try to pull them back? The mechanist, reductionists would say pull them back because they're broken. Whereas the organismic sort of approach would be like, no, they're actually kind of going through a kind of birth process here. They're kind of a breaking down in the service of breaking through. How do we support them, in completing that birth, coming out the other side and hopefully a healthier, condition than, where this process started. So you end up with a radically different, because the worldviews start so radically different, the way that you support them ends up being radically different.
Yeah.
And that's also why in one, you're going to have all these crazy, dozens, hundreds of differential diagnoses and more coming out all the time, and this mental illness, and that mental illness. Whereas the other, you just see a human being here who's struggling with particular needs, and they've developed certain strategies to try to meet those needs. And of course, whenever there are chronically unmet needs, there's always going to be very, intense emotions associated with that. We haven't really talked about that, but essentially needs and feelings are very closely related. So whenever we have a need met, we have pleasant emotions, and if the need's not getting met, we have unpleasant emotions, which is, hey, that's your organism saying, there's a problem here. These needs aren't getting met. Here, do something about that. So we don't see the feelings as actually bad. They're just simply messengers. They're just going, hey, there's a problem. So we don't try to get rid of the emotions. That's another thing, very big difference. We listen to what are those feelings or emotions telling us about the needs that are not being met by this organism, and how do we support them getting that met? So it's such a different paradigm, and it's such a different way of approaching, supporting people who are having these kinds of experiences.
Yeah, completely like compassionate response as opposed to a, like you say, a power over or shutting down of this process. And it was making me think of actually your analogy of the cancer cells, like actually what the psychiatric paradigm is doing is supporting the proliferation, right, of the cancer cells, of the growth of the cancer, because it's like, yeah, it's supporting the negative process, whereas actually or your more holistic model is saying, okay, we need to hold the person and allow this process to kind of, yeah, the birthing process to come to some kind of a solution and resolution of in its own way. So like the wisdom, like you say, the wisdom, it's not that the emotions or the behaviors are wrong, there's a real wisdom in that. And it's not for us as the holders to know what the answers are, because the organism has that wisdom within itself, right? So what would you say, Paris, is like according to your holistic model and your thinking so far, what would that holding look like? Like how could we meet the needs of the people that, I guess two questions are coming to me. How could we meet those unmet needs? And the other question is, would you see the fact that maybe more people are going through these processes as a reflection of the fact that society and the way that we're living at the moment are causing more unmet needs? So actually, we're not living in a way that meets our holistic needs, and therefore it's causing more distress. Would you say that's true?
Oh, absolutely. And all the kind of statistics I've seen certainly,
Yeah.
back that up, with the just generally, just a general steady increase of both chronic what we think of as more predominantly physiological conditions, but also psychological conditions. They're both ramping up quite fast, especially in the Western world, but even more globally.
Yeah.
So that seems to be pretty well backed, evidence-based. Um, so as far as how it like support someone, so the diagnostic process. So by the way, it's important to make a distinction between the word diagnosis and classification. So with the DSM and even the ICD, when we're looking at kind of the psychological kind of world, it's not actually diagnosis, because diagnosis, what you do is you find what is the cause, right? They haven't found any causes, right? From the bioreductionistic model, they've been looking for this, serotonin, dopamine. They're looking at all the neurotransmitters, this, that. And so from that perspective, it's actually not diagnostic at all. It's just classification. It's especially, generally it's a bunch of people, mostly older white men, sitting in a room, and mostly pharmaceutical industry backed, sitting in a room and voting on what the classification should be for so-called mental illness. So it's important to make that distinction. Like, there's often this credibility assigned to it, validity assigned to it, which is just not there at all. So it's important to kind of name that. So the kind of what I would call the diagnostic process. So if someone's in distress, there's always going to be an unmet need, right? The very definition, distress always implies some unmet need, whether it's safety or belonging, or freedom, or there's a kind of a whole collection of human needs that we all share together. There's universal human needs that we all share, just like we all share universal human like physiological nutrients. We're all kind of different in maybe the amounts we need, but there's a basic set of nutrients that we all basically need as humans. And same with psychosocial needs as well. We all need love and belonging and freedom and autonomy and meaning and et cetera. So we all have these kind of basic and ease and peace, and if one or more of those are not met, there's distress. Like I talked about earlier. That's basically our system saying, hey, there's a problem here. This nutrient, this need's not getting met. And so not only do we feel something unpleasant in the body, but we also feel an impulse to try to do something about it, to try to meet that need. So that's the organismic process. It's always there, that attempt to do it. Now, what we might do to meet the need might be a little while, especially if we have a really chronically unmet need. We resort to more and more desperate strategies to try to meet it. And especially if we're not very self-connected, we don't, we're just kind of operating off impulse, so we can kind of get in trouble. So the diagnostic, to use it, I don't really like the term, it's kind of medical, but anyway, we'll stick with that for now. Approach is to support the person in identifying what the need is, the needs that's not getting met. Is it safety? Is it belonging, inclusion, love, accept, companionship, or is it more freedom, autonomy, empowerment, et cetera? You need more peace in your life, you need more meaning in your life, right? So these are all human needs which cause distress when they're not met. So that's the process, is actually just basic empathy, sitting with this person, helping them self-connect, helping them identify what the needs that aren't getting met, and then working collaboratively to try to find sustainable strategies for meeting them. So that's just that's the basic approach. It's actually really quite simple. It doesn't require heaps of drugs and a lot of expertise, as for a support person, really, just being a human being yourself and being in empathy with this other person and supporting them in this more power with rather than power over way. Now, when we're working with someone who's, instead of more the worried well, you might say they've gone into something more extreme, right? They maybe had something more extremely traumatic happen to them, and now they're really kind of overwhelmed, and maybe they're entering into a kind of psychotic process, or maybe they're just holding deeply unresolved trauma, a kind of post-traumatic stress condition. It's still the same thing. However, the person has entered into, since they've entered into a kind of more extreme state, typically we have to start with safety, because on some level, whether it's, anytime someone goes in an extreme place, they don't feel safe. You can count on that. On some level, they don't feel safe. Whether they're objectively safe or not, it doesn't really matter. How do they feel? So you always have to start with, and that's why the current mental health system as it is so problematic, because the definition of trauma is two things. It's a threat combined with disempowerment. You experience some kind of threat, whether, it doesn't matter, again, if it's experienced internally, externally, whatever, but somehow you've experienced threat combined with helplessness or disempowerment. And so the antidote, at least initially, is safety. So you got to counter the threat, and empowerment. Safety and empowerment is the antidote. You have to start with that. And what does the current mental health system do? It comes in and takes over, and it's very disempowering, right? Really disempowering, sometimes extremely so, right? People getting tied down, forced drugged, et cetera, et cetera. So, and what do you do? What do you do if you do that to a person who's already feeling traumatized? You just exacerbate the trauma, right? That's exactly what happens to so many people there. And so their condition gets worse, and it's kind of a vicious cycle. So the first thing is how do we help them to feel safe as possible, as empowered as possible, but obviously within the constraints of not being able to hurt somebody else, et cetera, so that, honoring that limit as well. And then from there, once the person tends to feel safer, their nervous system settles down, they can start to self-connect. They can become clear, okay, what are the more nuances of what you really need here to kind of move through whatever's going on? Is it some unresolved trauma that just simply needs to be released from your system? Is it something deeper than that? You've initiated a kind of psychotic process where, your whole worldview is going through a profound transformation at the deep level, either way, it's not that different in our role. It's just, whether, how much support they need, how long they might need it, this kind of thing. So that's basically what it looks like, as far as the general support I try to offer myself with my work, and how I kind of visualize a more wholesome mental health system, coming with a much more power with approach. And, we understand all this stuff. This isn't rocket science, but the problem is we have some very powerful political interest with the, psychiatric pharmaceutical industry that does not want anything to change because they're doing very well,
Yeah, exactly. No. And it's interesting what you say, Paris, because it's not rocket science, but I kind of want to go into a bit into the transpersonal realm as well, because I think one of the huge problems is that we've, like, as a majority of humanity, we have forgotten, like, we haven't remembered our
Right.
transpersonal selves, right? So I know you come at your work with that lens, you're viewing people from this transpersonal perspective. And I know so I don't know if you want to mention
Yeah.
because I hadn't heard of the ISEPP before you spoke to me, where you've published your papers, but I think you spoke to me before about acknowledging, like, this paradoxical unity duality need. So we've got our physical needs, we've got the
Yeah.
needs of physical organism, but we've also got real unity consciousness transpersonal connection needs as well. And I think, for me, recognizing that through my own remembering experience, my own
Mhm.
awakening experience, I thought I would find answers in the transpersonal world. And maybe this is something we can talk about, because I think it's really important to go back to something you mentioned around the acknowledgement, these diagnostic categories there's no empirical evidence for them, right? And yet what I found in the transpersonal world is, through no fault of anybody's, but because the diagnostic categories in the DSM are so ingrained in our thinking, and it's like people just don't realize that then there's no scientific basis for them whatsoever. They're just
Mhm.
taken as read. And for me, I think this is like the key to everybody knowing that, is like, then we can start to acknowledge the transpersonal aspects and where the bridges are. Because I know this was your argument in Rethinking Madness was that actually psychiatry could benefit so much more from transpersonal theory if the transpersonal world would acknowledge the need to, like, just let go of the whole differential. Some people are having this beautiful awakening experience, and some people are just mad, because there isn't this dichotomy, right? So
Yeah.
can we go into that realm? Because I think,
Sure.
yeah, this is my passion. I know kind of this is where you've started. Um,
Yes.
sorry, I've just like offloaded a lot of stuff there, but it was kind of
That's
related to
right.
where you were going, I think.
No, and it's totally like, so what I've been talking about in a way kind of dovetails nicely into what you're talking about here. So I've mostly been in the kind of, we might say, dualistic realm. And for people who aren't aware, of that terminology, um, sort of dualism or duality is the experience of self versus other, the kind of separate, where, the subjective experience of like, oh, here's me, Paris, and there's you, Katie, and there's that tree, and there's the cat. And, there's that kind of dualistic experience between self and other. Whereas, as opposed to, in contrast to the unitive experience, where the boundary is dissolved to some degree, and there's a experience of, oh, actually, I'm part of something much larger than this limited self. Like there's the kind of analogy of, in the very broad picture, the universe is an ocean, essentially a continuous, contiguous ocean, and all manifestations, including me and you, are simply different waves on the same sea.
Yeah.
So there's, there's kind of bypassing the illusion of separateness and realizing that fundamentally there is no real separateness. We're all just different waves in the same sea. And of course, there's lots of different sort of, gray areas in between those two extremes, you might say. So I talked in my book, I came up with the term, the duality, unity, integrative model, because there's often been a lot of controversy. Is the world dualistic or is it unitive? And I was like, actually, they're both relative perspectives.
Yeah.
I'm coming from the perspective that, yes, fundamentally, and even, quantum theory and modern physics is totally panned this out. Fundamentally, there is no true separate selves. Everything in the universe is fundamentally interdependent and interconnected with every other manifestation of this universe. So even if you stay with the kind of most so-called, positivistic, or what some people might call the reductive, sciences, even physics has said, yep, that definitely fits our reasoning and our evidence. And so it's just helpful to kind of have those terms there. So everything I've been talking about so far from a support perspective is a little bit more about the individual needs and meeting those, et cetera. But a very essential individual need is communion, right? Companionship, connection with others. And there's different, and I would take it further to even say spiritual communion, which is actually, again, connecting to something, that ocean, that sea, that unified sea of which we're all a part, and having some kind of relationship with that. And then people can have it at different levels. Maybe it's just having a deep connection with your family or with your, local ecosystem or nature, or, there's different ways people experience that. But I think most people, when they contemplate this, they go, yeah, there's definitely times when I kind of feel like and we often call it love, when you feel a sense of where it's kind of like your boundaries dissolve and you feel this really deep, intimate connection with other, so love is probably the closest term we have in English language for that. But I think everyone can relate to that to some degree. So then we're kind of getting into the transpersonal, or having an experience beyond this limited personal self. And because of what I talked about initially, the very nature of contemporary society has become so atomized, so disconnected, dismembered. Well, not only from the natural world, but also even from each other in many ways. There's a lot of evidence talks about, like just rampant chronic loneliness. I mean, even though there's lots of us around, and there's lots of screens and things we can look at, and we can Facebook like each other and all this kind of stuff, that actually, that intimate connection with this, that transcends self, is actually like going the wrong direction. Like, that we're actually heading kind of the wrong way in general. And that is such a fundamental need, to kind of go back to that, that needs perspective, that on some level, just about everyone in the modern world, I think, feels distress. We don't even know why per se, but there's a distress because of the lack of that real intimate, kind of transpersonal love, connection, whatever you want to call that. And the more, of course, the more alienated and isolated we are, the more the distress, and vice versa. But it's kind of like this elephant in the room, or not even elephant in the room, because it's actually not even really seen consciously by so many people. It's just kind of recognized of this general dysphoria that I think most people connect to. But when you drop down deeply, I think the evidence is pretty compelling that it's really related to that. So much of that dysphoria is related to that isolation on that kind of spiritual, transpersonal level. And so, yes, obviously individuals can be supported on the practical ways, but collectively, there's a real moving into the cancer cell, moving into our own isolated state and forgetting we're part of this broader system. And when people have these kinds of awakening experiences, for, again, lots of shades of gray in that term awakening, but when we have, I think what we're generally pointing to is we've had that kind of we had some degree of a unitive experience. Like, oh wow, I am part of something. I'm not just this isolated being here. I am actually part of that, and it feels the nourishment of that is like coming across a oasis after days of being lost in a desert.
Yeah.
For me, it's just like, that's what I've been longing for so much. That's what most people will describe that kind of experience as, because it's like, oh wow, I just didn't even quite realize. We don't know kind of thing. But once you taste it, it's like, that's what your being longs for so much.
Mm.
So, and then taking it one step further collectively, that's if you look at conflict and war and the way we destroy our ecosystems and everything else, that we can only do that from a place of disconnection. So there's in the kind of nonviolence philosophy movement, they synonymize, they say it's synonymous. Violence and disconnection are essentially synonyms. They're essentially the same word. Because when you're disconnected from other, that's the only time you can do violence, because there's no care, there's no concern, there's no love for that being or that, that ecosystem or that, whatever it might be. So then we can quite easily do harmful things to them because they're other. But when you feel a sense of connection, then you feel that you actually experience this intimate love, whether it's again towards another human or a non-human animal or maybe the earth or nature more generally. It suddenly becomes really hard to do violence to that person when you're having that experience, because actually they're part of me. Why would I want to hurt them the same way I want to hurt myself? Like we're actually, there's that unified experience. We have the desire to hurt them is just as strong as the desire to hurt ourselves. And so that's when we actually look at the state of the world and, all the strife and polarization within society and between humans and earth, and realizing that the malady of that disconnection. It's really, I think it's as simple as that. And the remedy is connection,
Yeah. Yeah.
but on so many levels.
Yeah, I'm just thinking as well about like the multitude of like it's not just overt violence, is it? Like there's so many microaggressions that happen in
Right.
society, like you were saying in the psychiatric system, and the so-called treatments that happen now can be seen as because they are disempowering, they're not honoring the autonomy and the wisdom of each and every individual. They're kind of
Mm.
microaggressions. And I think, yeah, I mean, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of kind of the whole movement around, people rising up around neurodiversity and things like that. But I can see like particularly I think in younger people, just an acknowledgement of this, like we are literally being disempowered in the way that society is from so many angles. Uh,
Mm.
at the moment, and so I'm just wondering what your sense of, I guess, the ethics around this. So I mentioned the ISEPP, which I hadn't heard of before you mentioned it.
Yeah.
The International Society for the
Society for Ethical Psychology and Psychiatry.
So, yeah, what's your sense of the ethical need to acknowledge all of this, Paris? Because
Yeah.
this is kind of something that I've been really thinking a lot about recently. Is like this is a real ethical need
Yeah.
now because we are killing ourselves, we're killing the planet. So if we don't acknowledge, these transpersonal aspects of the remembering, um,
Yeah, that's right.
why is it an ethical issue?
So it'd probably be good to come back to answer that, say a little bit more about when I'm using the word violence, and I'm coming from the nonviolence philosophy, that was kind of been espoused by people like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela, et cetera. It actually doesn't mean like I have to like go and punch somebody or stab them or something. Like actually just anytime that you cause harm, and by the word harm, we mean you do something that undermines a certain need of theirs, whether
Yeah.
it's safety or kindness or whatever, care or whatever it might be. So I was using the word violence really, really loosely. And I think it could be kind of helpful because we don't really have a better word for that I know of yet. But um, if we kind of stick with that and we look at, essentially it's going back to that threat or trauma. Remember, the definition of trauma is threat combined with disempowerment. So violence is basically that, is actually is treating another being that combines as, I'm threatening them and I'm also disempowering them in some way combined. So essentially a traumatic event. And it could be a very tiny one. Maybe I'm just saying, calling someone a bad name, yelling at them, whatever. But in that moment, I undermine maybe their need for peace or self-worth or dignity or something like that. So it's, we might say it's micro, but still it's a kind of form of violence, you might say, to just something like that. And then if you look at the again, you look at just the general, it's not just the mental health field, even the medical health field that it certainly is perpetrates a lot of this, because with that kind of power over, not as much, not the same degree, because generally if people are diagnosed with physiological conditions, assuming they don't have significant cognitive issues, they generally keep their human rights. But when you get diagnosed with a mental health condition, your human rights could be gone just by the signature of one or two psychiatrists, right? So that's why there's a lot more possibility in the mental health field to really violate people's sovereignty and sense of personal empowerment and choice and autonomy and stuff like that. So there's the trauma events, that get perpetrated within the field, ironically, by people who often are well intended, because they're coming from a paradigm that's what I have to do. This person's broken and
And they've signed the Hippocratic Oath, right, to do no harm, and they don't realize
yeah,
that's what they're doing. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. I kind of feel like I lost the train of what your original question was, though. Just now. Maybe you did too. That's okay.
Yeah, don't. Oh, I think I kind of went back to the ethics
Oh,
because
ethics. Yeah, yeah. Right. Okay. So
yeah,
yeah, it's actually quite a good organization. I've been involved with them off and on over the years. International Society for Ethical Psychology and Psychiatry, ISEP. I think psychintegrity.org, I'm pretty sure, is the link. But they have a journal and stuff like that. And they're very much in line with a lot of what we're talking about. They don't take it further, into the transpersonal or the ecological realm so much. They really just kind of keep the more narrow vision of just ethics, but very much in line with what I'm describing here is, the ethics of treating people with dignity and honoring their sense of choice, not forcing, not only forcing medication, but also forcing diagnoses on people. And one thing that I learned in my work and research and all that is, you force a harmful paradigm onto somebody can be just as devastating, not more, than forcing, drugs upon them. And so what often happens, and again, the people who are doing this often believe the paradigm themselves, so it's a bit tricky. But, somebody comes to you and, they've got some emotional distress or, other kinds of psychosocial distress, or, maybe further along that continuum into, more significant post kind of trauma, distress, or even, psychosis and those kinds of experiences. You're often going to get the message, okay, you've got your brain's broken, and it's all, once broken, always broken. Sorry. So, you're gonna have to live with this for the rest of your life. And here's the stamp on your forehead. And you're gonna have to, but the good news is we got these pills. Now it's kind of, the problem is they got a lot of adverse effects to them, and we might have to give you more and more and more pills to manage all of that. But at least we can do that. And the other good news is at least you have a name for your condition now. And so that might even, that might normalize it and take away, some of the fear. Like, okay, it's a thing that other people have. So what ends up happening, people take on that belief system for themselves.
yeah,
And a couple of things, there's the actual physiological harm of, most of these drugs are pretty harmful, especially in the long term if you're on them for long periods of time.
yeah, yeah.
And the psychological harm of going, I'm a broken being, right? And I need to just be subservient to the experts and do whatever they tell me to do because I'm broke. You lose faith in your own organismic wisdom, basically.
Yeah.
And that's a huge rupture that causes so much harm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess, I think one of the things that I've really recognized is that initial stage of relief, because having that diagnosis, if you have a need for connection, it kind of meets that need of connection with connecting with other people with the same label,
That's
right?
right.
It's
That's
like
right.
you have this initial reprieve and relief, but then because and some people can get stuck there then forever because
Mm.
there isn't another.
Yeah, they get really attached to that identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's meeting a need. So why would you want to let go of that need? But then because there is no alternative offered, So yeah, sorry, I thought that was a
No, no, that's a really great point. And it's kind of paradoxical because on one hand, there's a kind of a shame of, oh, I'm broken.
yeah,
But on one hand, having the diagnosis counters the shame because, okay, I'm not just this freak. I've got this thing that other people have.
yeah,
Right, right. So on one hand, certainly there's a kind of, shame and stigma that's going to go with the fact that I'm broken in some way. And on the other hand, it counters the bigger shame of feeling like you're just this isolated freak, because I'm, part of a community now and we can share and we can actually have companionship around this and et cetera. So that can actually be, like you say, can be really reinforcing and people can actually become really quite attached to that, which it's a sensitive area. Like when I'm working with clients, I work with a lot of clients who are like that with their diagnosis. And I don't feel like on one hand, it's not my place to try to, again, I don't want to impose my worldview on them and do the same thing. But on the other hand, I want to let them know that there actually are alternative perspectives
yeah,
and also want them to recognize the possibility of change and movement and, growth and healing. And, so in this one moment in your life, you satisfy, according to that diagnostic Bible, psychiatric Bible, you satisfied the criteria so someone can give you that label. But that was just in that period of your life. Like we change, we heal, we move on. So do you really want to just stay stuck to that label your whole life? Like, what does that do to your sense of possibility of genuine transformation and healing? So yeah, it can be a kind of yeah, you have to be very cautious around how you broach the topic with people who are, attached to one way. But on
yeah,
the other hand, I would feel remiss if I didn't kind of gently challenge it,
yeah,
because I think it does keep people quite stuck,
yeah,
where they could, move through and pass that label in many cases. And,
yeah.
then they get kind of stuck there.
Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you when you were saying not only does it keep people stuck, you were saying it also, there are harmful side effects of medication if someone is on it for years, years and years and years on end. And that's often what happens, right? Within the
Right. Yeah.
current models, people are told you'll have this thing for life and you'll have to be on medication for life. So,
That's right. And so like, I mean, in medication's another one, people can get very attached to that. And of course there's physiological dependence, which is an issue that's often not talked about. Sort of there's
yeah,
that 800-pound gorilla in the psychiatric room for sure. That actually once people are on something for 6 months or a year longer, they're going to have certain physiological dependence. And then now you've got withdrawal issues, and that's
yeah,
often not acknowledged, unfortunately. But it's a very, very real and problematic thing that people are going to have to face down the road if they're on these things long term. And on the other hand, I'm very much of the opinion, that there can definitely be a place for temporary relief, from certain psychiatric drugs, as long as that's how it's presented.
yeah.
Like, look, here, proper informed consent. Look, we have these pills.
Mhm.
On one hand, they can sort of soften the intensity of your experience, the intensity of your fear, your depression, or
Yeah.
the extremity of what, the anomalous experience you're having, they can soften that.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, they don't actually, cure anything. They don't go to the root of the issue, but, they kind of manage those so-called symptoms.
Yeah.
And if you use them long term, there's a lot of potential physiological and psychological problems that can happen. So that would be a genuine informed consent process. How many people actually get that? Almost none, from my experience. And so if that was happening and people would be like, what, I have so much anxiety right now. I just need some relief for a short term. I need to sleep or whatever it is. It makes sense. Okay, here,
Yeah.
treat it as a temporary band-aid,
Yeah.
but not the solution. It's just a temporary band-aid. And the shorter the better,
Yeah.
like
Like,
it
let's
is.
slow the process down. Too intense right now, and you haven't slept for 3 days, so maybe
Yeah,
if
let's just get you to sleep. Let's do what it takes. We'll give you a little bit of chemical assistance to get you to sleep. Yeah, that can be super helpful for people at time. But now we want to try to wean you off as quickly as possible so you don't end up dealing with all these other problems down the road.
Mhm.
The idea of the minimum therapeutic dosage. So, that's actually a concept in the psychiatric field, but it's never really used properly because minimum would be zero for most people because there can be other things that could be done before you have to resort to the drugs.
Yeah.
But then if you do feel you have to resort to the drugs, then again, minimum dosage for the least period of time. And there may be some people for whatever reason, they're so stuck in in such a horrible kind of, state. They're kind of like, it's like a birth process is stuck halfway in the birth canal and never quite. There
Hmm.
can be some people who potentially might be on them for the rest of their lives, the minimal degree.
Yeah.
But the research shows that that's actually a very small percentage of people that actually needs that. You know,
Mm.
most people can definitely come off, relatively soon once they get the proper support in place.
And what's your sense of that, Paris? I don't know. I don't know if there is an answer to this. It's just a curiosity I have in terms of like why someone might get stuck in, say, an altered state process for forever. Is because, like you were saying before, when you've had such a traumatic life, or say you have a really, really challenging
Mm,
full life where you're living in a, impoverished environment, or you're living with abusive parents, or whatever the situation might be. And then you have this unity consciousness bliss experience where you're experiencing everything as love, and it's so wonderful. There's like, because there's often there's this, you know um spoken about in a quite a derogatory way, as if somebody can't then reintegrate their experience, but actually doesn't isn't that also wisdom? If someone's life experience is so horrendous, to stay in
mm.
bliss, the connected state is actually wise, because they're living in something that's,
If they don't have a choice, right?
yeah, like, and so it's, to
Right.
me, that then the answer is, it has to be about a societal shift and an
Mm,
equity, so that the needs of every individual in terms of basic needs of, safety, like you were saying, food, adequate accommodation, just feeling, yeah, having those really basic needs met,
yeah.
the responsibility of all of us. And something I
Yeah.
found in my research is, when people have these experiences and we are privileged enough to integrate and kind of come back to like, okay, what was this about? Why am I here? It's about this ecosystemic transformation of society as it is right now, in order that, because we are connected to that person that's homeless on the street. So it's our responsibility to like transform society and our ecosystem to
Mm.
a state of more equanimity. I don't know whether that is kind of
Mm.
where you've gone in your thinking.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot you said there. My mind kind of
Okay,
went in lots of,
yeah.
no, it's good. Lots of really great stuff. Um, yeah, so kind of the idea of, someone going into, sometimes it's called spiritual bypassing, a little bit of a derogatory term, but where someone has a genuine kind of unitive experience and then understandably gets, quite attached to that and doesn't want to, why don't want to come back?
Yeah.
This is lovely. And then there's reality that, I think the author Jack Cornfield has the book, After the Ecstasy, The Laundry. So the reality is we do this is the kind of duality unity kind of paradox, you might say. I mean, we still do have a body and probably some kind of family or other loved ones in our life and needs on that level that do have to get tended to. And if we kind of just hang out in this sort of euphoric unitive state and kind of forget about, our more dualistic kind of needs, from my experience, there's going to come a time where eventually you're going to crash. It's kind of like the Icarus myth. You get a little too high to the sun, your wings, as the myth goes, I think most people here probably know, the wings melt and you plummet. So that's the risk of kind of hanging out up there too long and trying kind of forcing it. It's like there's one thing to have the natural experience and then to integrate those unitive experiences more and more to your life, where they be, eventually you get to the point where you can kind of live with one foot in each camp and get through life really well that way. But this is what you're describing, something's a little bit different. They're really kind of trying to force themselves to stay there and not come back to the dualistic realm, not come back to the laundry, so to speak. And from my experience is there's kind of an imminent crash eventually. We kind of have, we do have a body and we have all the needs of that. And we do have these other needs, kind of more mundane, you might say, needs. And now they're not getting tended to at all while you're kind of just floating around up there.
Mm.
And so you can set yourself up for a kind of crash. And actually, it's no longer equanimity. It's not equanimity. Initially, it is a state of deep equanimity, like, wouldn't it, just I'm totally in my present experience and I'm taking that in. But now it's no longer equanimity of having extreme aversion towards certain actual natural experiences of what it means to be in existence, to be a living being in this world. I'm avoiding that, and so that's a problem in the long term.
Yeah.
Now, like you said, if you can't figure out a way to sort of make your living conditions better, what's the problem? But again, how can you figure out how to make them better if you're not actually living there? You're not actually living in your life. So at some point, I think it's important for people to come back to earth, to ground, to body, and try to, okay, now that I've had that, that's like a compass heading. I know there's this kind of unit of experience. I can integrate that in my life, and that can serve me now to try to make those changes in my life that will make, my whole life, including my dualistic, self-based life better. So,
Mm,
so that can actually serve you now.
mm, mm.
So I think that's an important distinction to make. And that's where it's kind of the spiritual bypassing terms of, how it's pointing to the fact you can end up having a big crash. And I've seen many people like that, actually.
Yeah, I was thinking more kind of if someone is so disempowered in their everyday life that they kind of it's beyond their means to make any change. And if I think it's quite a privileged thing, isn't it? In terms of kind of, coming back after those experiences and being able to make changes actually. Um,
Well, and the change could be how you respond to those situations as well. Like, if you're somewhat limited, you can still come back and inhabit, your body, your life here, but you can respond to those difficulties in a different way. Maybe you can't even, that expression, serenity to accept what I can't change, courage to change what I can, wisdom to know the difference. Okay, there's certain things in my life that are pretty hard and I can't change, but what can I change? Even if it's more just how I relate to the certain people or how I respond, or, I can come from a different place with that. And that can often have profound changes in even, otherwise toxic relationships that you might feel like you're stuck in somehow.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I guess there are different levels of it, aren't there? I'm thinking
Yeah.
like, yeah, people who are from maybe third world countries or, that where the living conditions are so bad. Yeah, or, if you're homeless and you're, you know,
Mm,
then at a point where systems fail you, so you're in this cycle of kind of not being able to integrate. But I mean, it's so complex, but I think
that's right. And all that's relative as well. Anyway, like you might be having a hard time with your basic day-to-day needs, like you're in abject poverty and stuff like that. But for example, there's been a lot of research showing, looking at different communities around the world, and oftentimes, like let's take an indigenous society, for example, not that there's many left that are still living in their natural sort of culture and ways, but we would consider them abject poverty. What, you don't have a TV, you don't have a cell phone, you don't have this, you don't have that. But plenty of evidence suggests that, when they're actually able to live undisturbed, their well-being is at least as good as what we experience in, even middle-class person in the modern world,
yeah.
because of the relationships they have with each other and with the natural world and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference, isn't it? It's like if you're living in an indigenous tribe where that's a really healthy way to be, that's so um nourishing for needs, right? Because you are connected to a natural way of being. Whereas if you're in this capitalistic
Right.
society where you're kind of you don't have I don't have a TV through choice, but it's
Okay.
where you're I don't know, you just you're
Yeah,
living on
you're very, yeah, you're exploited, you're,
yeah,
oppressed.
you don't have
Right,
access to a natural world because you're living on a concrete street and you don't have access to food. And I think those contexts.
right.
So I think that yeah, the
Why
reason
not just stay out up there in that play? Why even come? And of course you find that, don't you? Like you find much higher prevalence of extreme states and people who are in those heavily oppressed, exploited, poverty stricken.
yeah, because I live kind of out, in I live on the outskirts of small city, but kind of go into nature every day. And just recently, I've been to work in quite busy, deprived cities a few times, and like just noticing the increased amount of homeless people who are dissociated, walking around, talking to themselves and stuff.
That's right.
It's quite worrying, but yes,
Yeah, but then, like you say, on the other hand, it's like, can you blame them? You know?
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
that's kind of what I'm saying. And
Yeah.
I think when, when you have these experiences and are able to integrate and come back and do the laundry and, have the privilege of choosing to live the way that we want to live,
Mm.
it's like I feel like, okay, I have a responsibility to try and do whatever I can. Like, it's different, isn't it? It's not like, oh, it's my mission to save the world anymore, but it's my responsibility to do a part of changing this whole, being part of this evolutionary process, I guess,
That's
is
right. Yeah.
think
Kind
is
of reminds me of the concept of the imaginal cell. You've I don't know if maybe the audience is not aware of that so much, but when a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, right? It has to obviously create its chrysalis and go through a kind of deconstruction, kind of into a amorphous goo, basically, before eventually a new kind of being, a butterfly, emerges. But as it does that, there are these imaginal cells in the caterpillar that have the vision of butterfly. Somehow they hold the vision, whereas the majority of the caterpillar doesn't. The majority of the cells don't have the vision, but these imaginal cells do. So when the process begins, these imaginal cells get to work, starting to create transformation in the direction of butterfly. And the other cells fight tooth and nail, especially the immune system of what remains in the caterpillar fights and tries to kill these imaginal cells, because they're like, what do you do? You're killing us. You're killing. It's true, they're killing caterpillar, but because
yeah,
the other cells don't see the broader vision. But eventually the imaginal cells start to entrain other cells, and bit by bit, there's enough momentum to move and become, butterfly. So you could think about when people, as we kind of do this deep work, and whether, this self-connection work as well as the re-dash membrane work, and we start to, oh, that's right. I'm a part of this broader, extraordinarily beautiful, amazing world. And I want to, and what an extraordinary species we are, these, human beings. And when we really feel that, and not just, intellectually, but really get it in our bones, this sense of like, we're naturally going to want to, we're going to see all the harm happening whether in human society or in the earth in general. We're going to naturally feel pulled, but with our own unique gifts in this way. We're all going to have a different kind of type of passion or gift, you might say. But we're going to feel pulled in that direction of remembering humankind back into earth. And that's going to naturally, because that's what's happened. We become dismembered. And so and so most people who've had these experiences feel that pull
yeah.
somehow. And so if we start to live that pull and embody that,
Mm.
then we can trust it. We'll start to entrain others, and so on one hand, they get entrained in the general direction, but each other still finds their own unique sort of gifts, you might say. And so
Beautiful.
that's kind of, in a way, that's our, exactly like what you're saying, that's our work, is to connect. Once you have those more unitive experiences, almost certainly we're going to feel that, like, oh, we're going to see the contrast between that and the horribly disconnected world we live in now. And there's going to be a strong pull in that direction.
Yeah. So finding the other imaginal cells and like creating the vision together. Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, supporting each other, and even just living our own passion and trusting that others will naturally get drawn towards that. They'll see, hey, there's something happening there that seems to touch me in some way, and
Mhm.
starts to pull them out of their own trance, trance of dismemberment. And like
Beautiful.
you said, when you were talking about the word awakening earlier, it is a kind of awakening. Again, there's different shades, but it's kind of awakening from it. Basically, we've been in a kind of trance of dismemberment. We think that dismemberment is normal
Hmm.
when it couldn't, it's anything but normal, right? So called, or at least, well, maybe normal in the statistical sense now, but certainly not healthy.
Yeah.
It's not a sign of health to be, how did Krishnamurti put it? It's not a sign of health to
Oh,
conform to
being well
profoundly
adjusted to us.
sick society, kind of
Like,
thing.
yeah, yeah.
So, so in
Yeah.
a way, awakening, the word. not to use it in an elitist sense at all, but there is a kind of awakening that, we've all kind of been conditioned into a kind of a sleep, a kind of trance of dismemberment. And so as we start to come out of that trance, as a kind of wakening up to the broader unitive experience, the transpersonal experience that you described.
Yeah. Beautiful. So I knew about like the metamorphosis process, but I didn't know that the imaginal cells were attacked for a start and inside the chrysalis. That's so interesting as an analogy about where we're at right now.
Yeah, and if you do this work, you'll find that. I've certainly I noticed as I try to pull in that direction in my life, and I've certainly been attacked quite a bit here and there. So
Yeah. 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 Okay, so I'm noticing the time, Paris. So I guess we need to start wrapping up.
okay.
I'm just wondering what your unique imaginal cells vision is for where we're going or for where you're going in your part in kind of.
Yeah. It feels like it's an ongoing process in a way. Like it's twofold, I suppose. Clearly my own history and gifts, talents, whatever you want to call them, have led me into the work I'm doing now, which kind of more um, in the field of kind of psychology and trauma and supporting people and moving through that. And because of you might say, the larger, you know, image or vision that I've been fortunate enough to tap into, I really resonate with Leonard Cohen's quote, from one of his songs, that the cracks are where the light comes in. And so I've really seen that in my own work, that the silver lining, you might say, of having been through traumatic experiences, and by the way, who hasn't been to some, but the silver lining of that is for people who have experienced some kind of significant trauma, is a kind of thinning of their own veils, of cognitive constructs. Their own worldview tends to get sort of thin to some degree in that experience, and they're kind of awakening to, whoa, that wasn't sustainable, that's not working. And there's a push to move into a more sustainable direction. Often, not always, but with support, often that can be a catalyst for people to experience profound post-traumatic growth and actually kind of come out the other side with the kind of these more deeper existential rememberings that we're talking about.
Mm.
And so in a way, that's where those two layers come, into both, having been through profound kind of spiritual existential crisis myself, and having been through a lot of trauma myself, and kind of seeing the link. So in my own work, kind of supporting people, not just through recovering from trauma, but taking that further in that way. And
Mm.
then also, because I've had my own childhood being what it was, and very alienated, I turned to nature from a very young age, and felt a very strong kinship with, the non-human, the more than human realm, as some people call it, since I was very young. And so that moving further and further in a kind of more ecotherapy and kind of deep ecology realm, it's called, is really calling to me. So I'm still in what Bill Plotkin calls it a delivery system stage of exploring, what my specific sort of next delivery systems are going to be for this work. I'm clear what my passions are, but the actual delivery systems are changing. But it's getting more and more in the direction of um, working with collective trauma, on the more collective level, and then working more and more towards kind of the ecotherapeutic work of helping people connect to the natural world, the more than human world.
Yeah, beautiful. Because I was going to ask you, I think, just thank you for sharing that narrative because I think just for people hearing, we're not just talking about this, you're talking about it because you've lived it. You've lived that post-traumatic growth journey. And, I think I don't know about you, Paris, but I feel like people are drawn to offer what has helped them, right? So you've always had
Yeah, that's
connection
right.
with nature and ecotherapy, and now that's kind of what you're offering to other people. So yeah, a lot of my research participants were talking about how going through this journey, this transformation process, they all feel called to now offer a service to others that are going through
Mm,
a similar process. So I guess this is the imaginal cell piece, isn't it? We've all got a little part of the puzzle to play.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, so I know you mentioned briefly that you're thinking of starting another book, which I'm excited to hear. I don't know if you want to mention that.
Yeah. Yeah, so ever since publishing Rethinking Madness in 2012, 12 or 11, I think it was 12. I've been doing odd writings and kind of contemplative kind of reflection upon everything we've been talking about and other stuff. And then just kind of posting them as more like kind of, individual articles and things. Um, and now I'm at a point where I feel like I don't really have a whole lot more to say right now, like than what I've already said. Obviously there's ongoing evolution of my own process here, but it feels like important to kind of take all those strands and put them together in a coherent framework, and and have that as a second book. So that's what I'm kind of in the brainstorming. I've kind of got all the pieces here, and it feels like a puzzle that's all taken apart a bit, and it's all related, but wanting to put it together in an enjoyable, hopefully inspiring sort of broad framework of like a book. So yeah, it's kind of where I'm at now.
Yeah.
I've played with a few titles. I don't have one yet. Like Well-Being for the Whole Being was one title I played with. But yeah, we'll see. It's kind of the essence is very much what we've been talking about here.
Perfect. And I'm guessing this is kind of going to come together and it'll be what you're then offering as a service, right, to other people. So where can people find out more about your work? And I'll put the link with this recording, or
Yeah.
ongoing, I guess, news about when this book will be birthed into the world.
Yeah. So great. So I'm doing more and more trainings, by the way, and they're a combination of trainings for health professionals, some online, some in person. And also doing more trainings around the topics we're talking about here that are going to be online, just to make them more accessible to people.
Yeah,
I do want to do some in person, where we can kind of go out into the wilderness like we talked about, but that's obviously limited to people who are, near me in Utah area, or wherever I have, somewhere around this part of the US. But I'm definitely going to be doing more online trainings. I've already done quite a bit. Like I've done one on the theme of navigating global crisis towards personal and collective resilience. So that's a topic I've done a fair bit of that I want to keep bringing that back, and that'll be probably donation-based training. So it's accessible to everybody. And similar, like Toward a Shared Spirituality is another kind of training that I've done that's along the lines of what would be like a secular, kind of moving away from the polarization of the dogmatic, spiritual traditions and into a more secular, nature-based, systems-based approach, like what I've been talking about here.
okay.
So that's all of my trainings can be found on integrativepsychology.info. So one word, integrativepsychology.info. And it's a work in progress, but I'm getting more up there in the next couple of months, more trainings up there. And then I also have rethinkingmadness.com still. That's been around since the book, and I've a lot of good resources on there for
Yeah.
especially kind of for more extreme kind of spiritual existential crisis, psychosis, this kind of thing. Yeah, so those are probably the two biggest websites I recommend people to turn to based on what we're talking about here.
Thank you. I'll put the links down below.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm really grateful, Paris, to you doing this work, because I think, what I'm finding as well through conversations is I have quite a few mental health professionals contact me privately now and just say, thank you for speaking out about this. I'm finding it more and more difficult to work within the current system, the current paradigm, but they don't know where else to turn for an alternative kind of model or way of being. So I think there's the holding the people that are going through these experiences, but there's also holding the holders or the professionals, or whatever
Mm,
you wanna. We're all human and we all need holding through this crisis, this turbulence this transition that we're going through, right? It's not about demonizing. Everyone's doing the best they can with the framework that we've been given, and everybody's struggling. So yeah, just the fact that you're kind of now doing this work with clinical the clinical professionals is really needed as well. So yeah.
Thank you for all your work, Katie. Really, really heartening and encouraging to, yeah, have been connected to you over these last sort of 10 years
Yeah.
and witnessing your evolution and all your amazing contributions.
Thank you. Yes, just been so lovely to reconnect. And I said to you earlier, before we started to record, it must be so frustrating for people like you that you know, you have me coming along and basically repeating the messages that you've been saying a decade before. And it's like, you know, and now I'm seeing it too, but actually it's like, oh, thank goodness other people are, you know, it's like it feels like um, the strength of the collective voice is kind of, yeah, something's happening, isn't it? We feels like we're reaching a tipping point now, and change is kind of not got to happen. So yeah, just
Mm.
really, I'm really grateful that I've been able to find stability through finding people, you know, like you, and finding work that makes me feel sane in what I'm saying and doing. So really
Yeah.
grateful for you.
Oh yeah, it's so nice to have the kind of shared perspectives and values
Yeah.
yeah, just to say I'm not frustrated at all that you've been doing this work. And on one hand, it's wonderful to see you, you know, sharing some of the same perspectives with, you know, other audiences that what I've been talking, but then you bring your own unique perspective into it, which is so important. So I think I mean, we're all different fingers pointing to the same moon, if you will, but all those different fingers are important. Yeah, they'll have a different perspective. I think they're all
Love that.
important.
Yeah, we're all climbing the same mountain. We're all looking at the same moon, for sure.
That's right.
We're all swimming in the same sea.
That's right.
Oh, it's brilliant to reconnect. Thank you, Paris. And just, yeah, look forward to seeing where it goes. And no doubt our paths will merge at some point. I'm actually feeling called to a trip to Utah now, saying,
Oh yeah,
your
great.
vision.
Love to see you if you can make it. Should look me up.
Thanks, Paris. Take care and thanks for
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.